Welcome to the Writer Reads Chronicles of a Dark God, Book 2, Dark God's Rise, Chapter 44, Battle Joined. Samuel had almost finished fitting several neatly faceted gemstones to the griffin's second wing when a messenger knocked at his door. Grumbling, he lowered the slender cutter to the bench and stood. He lifted the new sharpening stone into his pocket without noticing, and turned toward the sound of knocking. The stone glowed in his hand, but he didn't see it shine, or feel the slight warmth that curled into his palm. It was in his pocket before he could register the touch of magic against his skin, unaware of the ancient deity watching his every move and gloating as its snare closed. Yes, the craft mage growled. The messenger swallowed, then drew herself tall and began to speak. Message begins. His lordship, Endura, bids you be ready to return to the palace by noon. He bids you be prepared for an overnight sojourn and wishes to inform you a knight will collect you for the noon meal. Message ends. I wait your reply. Samuel cleared his throat, thinking carefully before he spoke. Messenger, message begins. I am at his lordship's disposal and will be ready to leave a half bell before midday. Message ends. The messenger drew a breath, her eyes taking on a faraway look as she ran his reply through her mind. Understood, she answered. Your reply is as follows. Message begins. Samuel listened as she repeated his response, word for word. Please confirm, she said after the message had ended. Confirmed, Gareth answered, and she pivoted and ran swiftly away. Gareth closed his door at her departure, glancing at the sky as he went. A second look at the clock hanging on his workshop wall told him he'd read the sun right, and that he indeed only had an hour before Endura's escort arrived. Grumbling softly to himself, he hurried to his workbench and began to pack his tools. As he did, a sudden warmth in his pocket drew his attention, and he pulled the whetstone free. "And what are you doing there?" he asked. He was about to apologize and tell it he had to explore its origins before he could include it, when he paused. Lifting it to eye height, he studied it carefully, letting his gaze stray to the tools it had sharpened and considering his options. As new as it was, the stone had provided an added edge to his tools, and it was the best option he had available. If it brings such an edge to my tools, he thought, considering it, perhaps it will be able to smooth the blemishes from the old one's prison. His spirit leapt at the thought, and he tucked the whetstone back into his pocket. In the confines of his prison, Shira fought to maintain the aura of neutral innocence in which he'd wrapped his gift. It was hard. He wanted to laugh, to tear through his jail and howl with glee. He denied the urge. It would do him no good to have the aura slip and the stone's true nature discovered before he'd had time to fully convert the wizard to his cause. Hauling his glee under control, he wove his protective magic a little tighter. Who knew how well it would hold once in the Lord Knight's presence? He watched as Samuel checked the last of his tools before setting them carefully in their carry case. The last tool was the whetstone, which he took from his pocket and settled gently in the pocket once occupied by the stone that had broken. The wizard remained unaware of his attention, carrying the case to the door as soon as the stone had been secured in place. He remained unaware, as Walshira shifted his focus from him to his servant in the city of Deverath, and it was fortunate he didn't feel the hunger that surged through the old one at the king's preparations. Ruler of Deverath though he was, the king had prepared a feast that had him wanting to snatch the sacrifice from altar and pillar alike, and it was with great effort the old one held his greed in check. In Deverath, the king stepped back and surveyed his preparations with growing satisfaction. Everything was perfect, from the silenced mages hanging on the walls and pillars to the trembling but magically immobilized apprentices set in the midst of the summoning pattern drawn on the temple floor. Everything was perfect, that is, save for the discontent and disapproval coming from the captain of his guard. The king couldn't see the man, but he'd enspelled the man's badge to carry all sound of his voice to his ears. He could hear the man wasn't happy. "The king is insane," the man said, and another voice was picked up by the badge. "He's possessed by some demon." "He's a madman," a third exclaimed, then hastily lowered his voice. "We have to stop him. We cannot allow him to sacrifice innocents, no matter what wars that foul power helps us win." Other voices joined the disapproving clamour, all in agreement, and the king turned to Reuben. "Do you hear them?" he asked, and the undead captain nodded, baring his teeth in the mockery of a smile. "I'll bring them," he said. "Tell them the king has summoned them." "I need a half turn of the hourglass to prepare," the king told him. "Then our lord Walshira will have arrived." Reuben stopped, bowing slightly in acknowledgment. "It shall be as you command, my lord," he sneered, washing the honorific in sarcasm. The captain's newfound insolence made the king seethe, but he reined in his fury. Whatever favour the captain thought protected him wouldn't save the creature. When the time was right, and with Walshira's approval, Reuben would suffer the consequences. Until then, their king smiled. Until then, I'll let the man run. Having decided Reuben would suffer, the king turned his attention to summoning his god. Lifting his voice in the required syllables for the spell, he ignored the groans and whispered denials of his captives. They would lose their lives and souls, but Walshira would be fed, and pleased with his service, and that was all that mattered. The chant wound itself around the captives, forming chains of golden light, and one of the apprentices used his terror to shake himself free of the binding spell. He rolled to his feet and darted beneath the chains before they could tighten about him. Reuben's second in command reached for him and missed. The boy saw the end wall of the temple slide partly open and ran for the gap. He barely avoided running into the captive-laden zombies returning from their morning's errand. Another soldier joined in the pursuit, only to have his passage blocked by the zombies. By the time he'd fought his way past them, the boy was gone, vanished into the mazework of tunnels that formed the secret byways of Devarash's underbelly. The king continued his chant. He was relieved he'd set the child on the outer ring, doubly so to have decided to use more lives than the god needed. One more escapee would not mean the ceremony's downfall. The door began to close, grinding its way through the king's chant and making it difficult for him to focus as he stepped up to his first victim and brought the blade down. Walshira descended before the first drop of blood hit the floor. Seeing their colleague's demise, some of the mages groaned in fear, and some whimpered a denial. Others began to weep, but all watched in horror as the thick cloud of darkness swept down from a suddenly opened gash in the ceiling to engulf their fellow. The king took a single step to the left and sacrificed another, and then felt the knife plucked from his hand, his god taking control of the ceremony. He stood still as Walshira billowed and rolled across the summoning pattern, relieved as the god's cloudy form parted around him. Every now and then a smoky tendril of cloud lashed out to strip the emotion-laden air of its essence. The deity fed, undisturbed by the screams that rose and fell around it, and deaf to the cries for mercy that rose at its approach. Reuben arrived with the palace guard as he finished, and Walshira read the men's mood the instant they entered the temple proper. "More doubters!" he roared, his voice shaking the temple. The king cringed, flinching as the god stretched a coil of smoke to stroke his cheek. "My child," Walshira said, "my dear and faithful servant, I am going to cleanse your palace of the infidels infesting it, and when I am done, every living being upon these grounds will either be my servant or food for my servants. There will be no middle ground." He'd barely finished speaking before he descended upon the captain and his men. Screams of agony rose from within the cloud, and those waiting the king's knife struggled to escape. Tears ran down their faces as they stared at Walshira's feeding dark. Those tears dried as that darkness lifted from the palace guards and flowed from the temple, revealing the creatures he'd left behind. Fear dried their throats as the once living guard rose from the temple floor and turned toward them. "No!" the king shouted. "You cannot take those. They are for the god's use, his meat and strength." The palace guard captain turned burning eyes toward him, hatred setting his gaze alight as he extended a bony finger toward the king. "You, who have brought us to be remade, have no right to deny what the god has already bequeathed," he snarled. "3 of these he has given us to share. He said he could spare that many." "And did he tell you which 3?" the king challenged. The creature that had been his guard captain turned his head and directed its burning gaze across the wizards. That he did, the creature allowed. That he did. His gaze settled on one of the wizards chained to a pillar, and his newly grown claws scraped on the floor as he led the things that had once been his men toward him. The hapless mage struggled against his chains, his fear growing from wordless moans to shouts of denial. His chains rattled against the stone, stilling, as the captain pressed his face against the man's frightened visage, and the mage froze. Be still, the captain ordered, and the king thought he saw vapour wisp from the creature's mouth and flow between the man's lips. Regardless, the wizard stopped his struggles until the first of the captain's once men knelt and bit deeply into his thigh. He started to scream then, and went on screaming, as the captain left 4 of his men to feed, and led the rest to the next wizard Will Shearer had gifted them. As the second man began to scream, the king bowed his head and waited for his god's return. Halfway through the feeding, when the screaming had stopped and the chosen wizard's struggles had faded to the final twitches of death, Will Shearer returned. He licked the spent emotions from the temple's air and devoured the sudden terror his arrival spawned with an air of satisfaction. Then he turned his attention to his high priest. "Are these all the wizards you could find?" he demanded. The captain and his subordinates ceased their feeding. "Bring them all to me," Walshira demanded of them. "You can feed to your soul's content after you have brought me what I need." The guard captain raised his blood-stained face and looked into the darkness that was his master. "And what would that be, my lord?" Walshira's darkness shifted, coalescing into the form of a man dressed in the finest, darkest silk. And then he smiled. "You have tasted magic," he stated. "Now you will find those who hold its potential for me." The captain gave him a single nod and led his men away. The secret door at the end of the temple slid open to grant him access to the secret paths that ran below the city streets, and the god and his king watched them go. It was not the only sight, the Old One observed. Even though his projected self walked the temple palace, he remained confined to his prison, observing the world beyond through his projection and the eyes of his other servants. Still trapped, he had opened 2 windows so he could see the world beyond. In the first window, he saw the guard captain and his men enter Deverath's depths. In the second, he watched the mottled beast elf leave the south gates of Coranth. The creature didn't leave alone. Instead, he rode beside Coranth's ruler at the head of an entourage consisting mostly of knights, wizards, and priests. It is time, Walshira decided, as the group made its way up the mountain. There was no mistaking the direction in which they were headed. In the temple, he turned his projection to face the king. "I must go," it said, "for I have a battle to fight. When it is over, I'll return to you to take the power I need from this hall." "As you wish, my lord." The king bowed, the air swirling around him as his deity transformed from man to mist, and lifted from the temple. Hearing the sighs of relief that ran around the temple's walls and pillars, the king turned to face his prisoners. Some were already closing their eyes, turning their thoughts inward, perhaps attempting to find the words to a spell that might free them. "Well, we can't have that now, can we?" the king murmured, and drew on his connection to Walshira. His soft chant filled the temple, and whimpers of worry rose in scattered clusters. And then Walshira answered, and the wizards were frozen in their chains. The king smiled as he turned away. There would be no escape now. Wizards could not cast if they could neither speak nor move. The spell he'd chosen would hold them still and silent until Walshira came to suck their emotions dry and devour their souls for his pleasure. He was still smiling as he took the passage to his chambers. Having provided enough victims to satisfy the royal guard's needs, he now desired pleasure of his own, and he intended to find it. Meanwhile, in the distant Coranth, Roma and the Lord Knight Endurer left the city gates with a full complement of wizards, priests, and knights. The guards manning the city walls watched them go, hiding their worry behind a spectacle of too hearty cheering and too vigorous waving. The Lord Knight and those accompanying him waved back, and Roma copied the gesture with a small wave of his own. He knew those cheers were mostly for his host, but also that they had to be acknowledged or the guards would come to resent him for ignoring them. They rode on, letting the cheers fade behind them, and reached the foot of the mountain by mid-afternoon. As they continued up the first slope, a heavy sense of waiting enveloped them, and Brianda shivered. Roma reached over and laid a hand on her shoulder. As his palm touched her sleeve, he felt a jolt of power flow into the half-elf and looked past her. His gaze met Alessia's, and she smiled at him, taking her hand from the half-elf's other arm as she did so. Roma dipped his head in silent acknowledgment, grateful for the wizardess's intervention. The half-elf would be protected, perhaps even better than themselves, by the magic they'd just poured into her. A clatter of hooves drew his attention, and he looked toward the sound. The foresters had ridden closer, approaching the Lord Knight with worry in their eyes. "My lord," it was Rianne, the elven forester, who spoke. "We ask your blessing that we might safely scout the path ahead." Endura raised his hand and reined his horse to a halt and looked at Rioma. "Well, priest," he said, "what think you?" "I agree," Rioma said. "We need the blessing of the gods, and I think we should turn from the mountain's shadow in order to receive it." Endura thought this over in silence, then glanced at the aging sky. A murmur of agreement rose from the priest behind them, and he nodded. "Very well." They moved a little off the path, raising puzzlement in the burning eyes that lay in wait for them further up the slope. The puzzlement blazed into resentful hatred as the eye's owner watched the priests bless their companions. Saliva dripped in gravelly streams as the watchers saw the blessing's completion, and noted how Endura set the foresters on the path ahead of the little company. This time the female elf would not escape so easily. The ambushers watched as the elves bade the priests farewell and made their way up the hill. They let the elves pass them and held themselves in tense concealment within the rocks with which they had melded. The scouts' horses still sensed their presence, however, and shied away in alarm. Rianne dug her heels into her mount's sides, urging it forward and forcing herself to keep moving, even though the horse danced beneath her. Somehow she persuaded the animal to continue past the outcrop, and was relieved when her companions managed the same. As soon as they rode alongside her once more, she signalled them in close. "Ambush," she whispered, "and the rocks behind us." As quietly as she spoke, her whisper still carried to the waiting weirds. Gleaming eyes snapped open and the rocks exploded outward. This frightened the horses further, and they leapt forward. Rianne saved herself from falling by grabbing the saddle's pommel with one hand and pulling the reins tight with the other. The horse was well trained and slowed its panicked flight, answering her demand to turn. The outcrop was no longer there. 4 twisted earthweirds had taken its place, and Rianne was glad she hadn't sounded the alarm while they were between the rocks. There would have been no escape if she had. The human ranger succeeded in turning his horse, as did her elven compatriot. The elf took a small golden horn from his belt, sounding it in notes that rang high and clear and urgent on the mountainside. Rianne slid from her mount, drawing the twin blades she carried. The human stepped up beside her, his own paired swords gleaming in the afternoon sun. The weirds rippled toward them, the ground crunching beneath their bellies. The notes from the golden horn ceased, and the trio blocked the path before Welshira's creatures. Their horses wheeled around the threat, fleeing down the mountain as fast as the terrain would let them, and Rianne breathed a sigh of relief. At least the animals would escape. Below them, Endura heard the horn ring clear above them. "Knights," he ordered, and there was a shuffling of the ranks at his back. "Go!" All the knights surged forward, all but Magrillo, who felt Fianre urge him to stay with the Kavarag's half-elf. And he wasn't alone in remaining behind. The Kavarag was also reining his horse back, pulling hard to keep his mount from following the knights. "I think," he said, breathing hard with effort, "that we should leave the horses behind. They only make things more difficult." Magrillo had to agree. "We can still make the citadel doors if we hurry," he said. This was greeted with murmurs of agreement, and soon the horses had been slapped into a run toward the city. Free of the need to fight their mounts for control, the wizards and priests followed after the knights, bringing defensive spells to mind. Sounds of battle guided their steps. Metal clattered against stone, and war cries from the knights mingled with the unearthly roars of Walshira's minions. Roma glanced toward Alessia and saw her tense. Lightning began to crackle around her form, and he carefully drew Brianda away. A bend in the path concealed the battle, but as they rounded the turn the priest saw the four earth weirds facing the foresters and the knights. They were battling in a small dell, the knights having abandoned their mounts and drawn their blades. As they had in the scry, the weapons gleamed in multicolored hues, and their voices added to the cacophony of battle. The priests and wizards had formed a circle just inside the rim of the dell, and the knights formed the outer ring, engaging the weird snake-like forms. Raomar guided Alessia and Brianda into their midst, and drew a portion of Staravan's power to himself. He did not notice when Brianda slipped from his side and away from the battle, working her way up the mountain out of sight of the weirds. By then he was moving to tend the first wounds inflicted by their opponents, relieved when he noticed that the elf lord Magrilor had gone also. Remembering what had happened in the scry, he could only assume they were going to open the citadel's doors. He just prayed to the gods they could.